Okay, at this time, we're going to call the meeting to order. And Mr. Vogel, will you please do a formal roll call?
Certainly, Mr. Chair. Senator Champion. Senator Champion. Ms. Dawson.
Present.
Mr. Esme. Mr. Esme. Vice Chair Evans.
Here.
Chair Gaffin.
Present.
Mr. Hanson.
Present.
Ms. Huntley. Ms. Huntley. Mr. Urban.
Present.
Ms. Kaser.
Present.
Mr. Kammer.
Present.
Lieutenant Knotts. Lieutenant Knotts. Judge Kulik. Judge Kulik. Senator Matthews. Senator Matthews. Ms. Mattson. Ms. Mattson. Representative Mueller.
He's in the waiting room.
Present. I'm here. Present.
Sorry, was that Ms. Mattson or Representative Mueller?
Representative Moeller's here.
Okay, thank you, Representative. Inspector General Modi.
Present.
Mr. Page. Mr. Page. Ms. Robertus.
Present.
Representative Robbins.
Present.
Mr. Sandoval. Mr. Sandoval. Ms. Sherlock, or sorry, Judge Satterback.
Present.
Thank you. Ms. Sherlock.
Present.
Mr. Tatum. Mr. Tatum. Ms. Williamson.
Present.
Thank you, Ms. Williamson. All right, Mr. Chair, 14 of the members are present. A quorum is present.
Thank you so much, Mr. Vogel.
It's email.
Thank you so much, Mr. Vogel. We want to just quickly identify that the meeting minutes from our last meeting, which was February 25th, are now and have been posted on the task force website, and want to open up to anyone who has any comments, corrections, amendments to those meeting minutes. So if you have something, raise your hand. Seeing no hands raised, we're going to adopt the meeting minutes from the February 25th meeting as posted. Thank you. We've sort of jumped over one hurdle, and now we've got about 8 months to do some real work and sort of get to that finish line. So I just want to thank everybody for their continued effort and support. Today we have a presentation, and I'm going to ask Vice Chair Evans to introduce that. I did just see an email, Mr. Vogel, that people are in the waiting room that would be part of that presentation. I don't know if they've been let in yet, but if they haven't, let's do that. And I'll defer to Vice Chair Evans to do the introduction. Thank you.
Is everybody in well?
I believe so, Vice Chair Evans. I'm seeing Amy's iPhone.
Yep, there's
okay.
Amy. And
Yeah.
are you all together, Amy?
We are.
Okay.
We were trying to get our conference room to join here. So,
Okay. You let me know when you're ready. I'll start with the introduction and then you just interrupt me when y'all are ready. So Amy Dawo is our incoming president for our incoming president for March, which is our professional association for substance use disorder. She was the last year the co-chair or the chair for our government affairs committee. And Tom Meyer, I've known for years. We sat on a Second Chance Coalition together. And so they're gonna together talk about the impact. We sent out the survey to the March members to talk about background studies, how long people had to wait. We sent out a little survey to folks. And so they have some of that information, but then also some information from New Way as one of the larger organizations that works with staff and clients. And so I'm really grateful to both of them to be here to share that information with the task force. So thank you both for being here. Are you ready?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I'm Tom Meyer. I'm here to talk a little bit about the organization called New Way, where I work. And part of my role is to oversee HR, which of course has authority over the Net Study 2.0 activities that New Way conducts on its staff. So just to give you a kind of a scale idea, New Way employs about 300 people on any given day. And then there are an additional 350 contractors who work for us. So we got about 350 people on any given day who are subject to background study. New Way's also got this accreditation where it has to pay very, very close attention to the Net Study 2.0 background studies, because that's our primary way of screening employees. So we have a 245G license in many different locations. We've got 13 different locations. Most are co-occurring. We do not have any standalone mental health or childcare licenses presently. Right now, we are conducting about 275 Net Study 2.0 background screens each year. And that's increased over the past several years. In 2018, we conducted about 200. 2019 was about 250. 2020 was 250. And then 2021 was the 275. Of all of those background screens that we've been conducting, we've had a total number of 6 persons who've been disqualified outright. We've had another 6 persons who've applied for a set-aside, and 5 of those persons who have applied for a set-aside have received them. That's great news because that means people are getting set-asides. However, our challenge is the waiting period for a set-aside and the process through which people have to go. On average, it's been 6 months from the start of the set-aside application to notification. And it really depends, it seems like, on the number of offenses that the person may have on their record and the number of states in which they have lived during their adult lives. One of the challenges that we've experienced during during the set-aside process is really, I think it's probably a shared experience with all of the organizations that you will hear from. But it mainly has to do with supervision of persons who are on provisional approval to work for us. And that includes the cost of supervision, the cost of training, onboarding, and that bit. We estimate that it costs just under $25,000 for us to do the sight and sound supervision that's required of someone who is eligible to be a provisional employee. Something that I'd like to highlight in particular is the disproportionate effect that the set-aside process has on the entry-level employee, because it's mainly entry-level employees who are subject to the set-aside process at this point. Most of our professional staff are being screened while they're in school. That didn't used to take place. That's improved over the years. So there's no surprises when they get out of school, whereas we call it our tech staff, the people who are coming in at $20 an hour or so, who are doing the real heavy lifting with clients and basically affecting the most change in the community with our clients because of their lived experience and their wisdom in becoming a productive member of society and regaining that social capital. It's those people who aren't able to get through the set-aside process in a timely fashion. And it has to do with the fact that oftentimes they're daunted by, assembling 40 pages worth of history in order to prove that they are indeed rehabilitated. I mean, I would compare it almost exactly to, the amount of work required to submit a pardon extraordinaire through the governor. And then, of course, these are persons who are struggling to gain a foothold back into society. So their mobility may be such that they may live at several different places and during the time that they're waiting for a set-aside. And as a result of that, the timeliness and notification doesn't often get to them. I will say, though, however, having experienced the Net Study 2.0 process and the process that preceded it, and I'm going back, probably 25 years in this career, but the new process is far, far better than the old process. I mean, most people will remember, I think, the orange, blue, and yellow forms we used to get. Those would go out by US mail. And oftentimes we wouldn't know, what the status of a particular candidate was until sometimes months after the background study had been submitted. And now we get them, the background studies back very quickly. We have all of our staff rosters in one place. So if I had to assess the progress made since even the 2000 aughts, is quite remarkable in how this process has been streamlined and decreased the level of impact on some of the, these really key staff. I mean, these are the staff, the tech staff are the ones who our clients listen to. They're the staff who have regained a foothold. They've become productive citizens. They're establishing their social capital again, almost desperately in some cases. And they're the ones who have the most poignant voice when it comes to convincing the clients what to do next, how to do the next right thing. All in all, this is a good process. However, it's the set-aside aspect of it that creates some trouble for those key staff. And if there was one ask to take away from what I'm saying today, it's how can we make the set-aside process more friendly to, in particular, the persons trying to get into 245G or SUD licensed work.
Thanks, Tom. Mr. Chair, would you like me to proceed with my testimony?
I had just a quick couple questions, and thank you so much. When you were talking before about the increase in background studies over the last few years, does your organization have an understanding as to why that number has gone up? Is it just growth within the organization or some other issue?
It's two reasons. One, the organization has indeed grown, but also particularly during the last couple of years, the length of stay within one. So our turnover rate has increased somewhat during COVID, but also we operate 13 different licensed facilities, and oftentimes we try to flex staff across facilities so that every time someone needs to be cleared for a study that, or a location that might be just across the street, as it is, we have to do a separate study. And if on that point, I'll share one other piece of information. Our HR director remarked to me, he was surprised at the cost increase from 20, I think it used to be $20 per background check to 42. That's the doubling of it is certainly eye-catching, but it's also fairly understandable given the fact that people are being studied several different times. I mean, for example, I've got 14 different background studies on me as a manager here. And every time we open up another location, we got to add someone to that.
Thank you. So, and one last question, and you spoke about the provisional piece after requiring the sight and sound, and I just want to make sure everybody in the committee in the task force understands that. My understanding is you submit a background study. If it comes back with the individuals disqualified and they request a set aside, that person is allowed to work in that interim period as long as that individual is within sight or sound of another individual. When you were talking about the provisional aspect, is that what you were referring to?
Correct. Yeah. And where that affects residential operations the most are, say, during the overnight shift, when it becomes certainly more difficult to have either a manager or a second staff available to do the sight and sound supervision.
Are there times when, as an organization, you simply cannot do the sight sound requirement and somebody just can't work during that provisional period?
Yes, we try very hard if someone is subject to sight and sound to schedule them during the day or during the evening. However, we've had to make very hard decisions about very, very well qualified candidates who simply we can't provide the supervision for because the cost of supervising effectively doubles the cost of labor for that facility.
Thank you. And maybe we'll just have you guys finish your presentation and then we'll just open it up to questions for everybody. I just didn't want to forget my questions. All right, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members for having us here today. My name is Amy Delwo. I also am an employee of New Way. I'm the Vice President of Public Policy. However, today I'm here presenting as the March President-elect. And as Ms. Evans had indicated, we did do some pulsing of our membership, specifically those providers who are involved in requesting background studies to get some information. So I'd like to follow a similar schematic in terms of what Mr. Meyer did in walking through some of the questions. And I do have a few comments from members that I will share as well. So just as a backdrop, I wanted to highlight that in your report or in the report, it indicates that people in recovery who want to bring their experience and expertise to this field can face considerable barriers if their previous substance use brought them into contact with the criminal justice system. And that's certainly one of the things that we have acknowledged here, and that a lot of times can be a barrier that people have interfaced with the criminal justice system as a result of their substance use. In terms of how many background studies were conducted, our membership had quite a wide range. There were some that responded to our survey that had only 13 a year, and then others that had remarked about triple digits, so 282 or 277 background studies done in a year. Now, in terms of those that applied for a set aside and received a set aside, the numbers that were reported are pretty consistent with what your report also is saying, that basically 80% that had applied actually received a set aside. So that is good news. But the bad news, I think, in this is that the reconsideration process is quite time consuming for the applicant involved. And so we've heard ranges of people indicating that they're needing to assemble a 40-page document. On the outside, there was someone who remarked about 140-page set-aside request occurring. And I think that, any one of us trying to put together a document that's 140 pages or even 50 to 60 pages can be a daunting prospect. And so in terms of or the proposition, if you will, of assembling something like that, it appears that there is a percentage, 65%, I think, is what your report is indicating, of folks that don't even request a set aside. And I think that the proposition of how involved it is very well may be one of those reasons for that consideration. Now, there was a member who provided a quote that I wanted to read to you that says, when we can get these folks hired, it's a great example for our clients. It shows them there is hope in recovery. People might trust them and give them chances if they keep making the right choices. Not to mention the study subject themselves. How many times are they going to get rejected for a decent job before they settle, give up, and start their downward spiral again? Basically indicating that it's a trigger to a recurrence of symptoms. I was on a federal panel the other day, and a gentleman kind of put it plainly to me, which is people achieve recovery when the community has given them redemption. And I think this is an example of that. The next area that you kind of had us explore was about the average waiting period for the initial application. So folks gave us some ranges, if you will. So one of the ranges indicated it can be kind of a couple weeks to 18 days or so on the short end, but certainly we heard months in terms of a month, 5 months, and some are saying 7 months in terms of a return. And so I wanted to relay to you a couple of the vignettes that members had responded back. Certainly it's not the case with everyone, but this particular organization seemed to be somewhat sophisticated in indicating that on average it's 10 to 30 days. Typically after 30 days, I would have to call and tell the state that this person was unable to work until the application was approved. And then typically it would take 2 to 3 days. Without a phone call, I don't know how long it would have taken. And we had to do this every time. So this person had a contact, knew to reach out, et cetera, to facilitate the process perhaps happening quicker than some of the others that have experienced months. One other account that someone had shared is that we're waiting over 8 weeks so far for 2 set-aside background studies to be cleared or notified. Therefore, an intern can't start their hours within the time frame of their semester, and a staff member won't be able to work alone. Therefore, we need to pay extra staff members to work with her as she needs supervision until her background study is cleared. One of their background studies actually got deleted from the website completely, so they had to resubmit for a second time, and just identifying that costs money. I'll skip on to, in terms of the waiting process, in terms of costs. Because we did a survey, we weren't able to really chat with people to kind of unpack this a little bit more. But some people interpreted the cost of the process, if you will, in terms of identifying that there's overtime, there's administration, it's additional burnout. There's disruption and also staff turnover. Others decided to quantify this monetarily. So one organization indicated that for them, the total for a set aside can cost upwards of $58,000. Another organization who was looking at this as being a month-long process identified that the training was about $1,200 cost for them. The supervision was running about $3,000, and that additional waiting costs were about $1,600. So in summary, I'd say that it's expensive for employers during this time to conduct the training, supervision, and then have an unknown outcome in terms of whether or not that investment actually will have a return in being able to hire that staff person on, as well as the guessing about how long that process may take. And so it makes it challenging as a business to make that calculation. I think with that, I'd like to pause, Mr. Chair, and see if there are additional questions. Thank you for your time to testify.
Well, thank you. And thank you for all the work that you've done putting these really interesting statistics and thoughtful analysis together. Why don't we open it up to the entire task force to see if there are questions for our friends at New Way. I'll defer to you, Mr. Vogel. You always see the hands faster than I do. Oh, Miss Evans, please.
So I have a couple of questions coming in on my cell phone that I want to ask. So just to get this on the record, Mr. Meyer, is it true that there are different, when we get disqualification letters, there are different types of supervision and that not everyone can be supervised? That, so for instance, that some people during their background study are not allowed to be supervised. We have to just wait till the study comes back, and then others are able to just work. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. We see two different types of letters arriving from that study. The first and the most common is one that says this person can continue to work, but more information is needed on their background study. And as a result of that, we then have to make the decision right then and there whether to continue to let them work or gamble on whether or not it's going to come back with a disqualification. Most of the time, if we get that letter, our organization elects to continue to allow that person to work. There's a different letter that arrives less frequently, and that's a categorical disqualification that says that person that's being the subject of the study needs to be removed immediately, in which case, we don't have any options but to do so. I'm heartened. I gotta tell you, I'm heartened by the number of more information is needed letters that we get, though, because in the old days, when we had the orange, yellow, and blue forms, if a yellow form came back, we wouldn't know for many months. Oftentimes, the yellow form is the equivalent of more information needed back before Net Study 2.0, and in that case, we were truly making a gamble, whereas now we generally know that the background study is being worked on. However, more often than not, those come back allowing the person to work in our organization, and we don't have nearly the level of or the number of people involved in the heavy duty criminal justice system as some other organizations. I'm just for example, my past employer, we had a lot more applicants who were coming in being studied for, and they were coming in from heavy duty involvement in the criminal justice system, multiple felonies, most of them drug related, right? Most of them were either possession or sales charges, going back 10 or 15 years. And oftentimes those persons, ended up either being categorically disqualified due to a technicality, provisionally allowed to work with a yellow letter, but then couldn't follow through on the set aside process because it was it was too much. I mean, I consider myself capable of assembling a pretty big application if I need to for work. And when I've seen some of these set aside applications, and they're epic in their length. They are 40, 60 pages. And sometimes I'm just amazed at how people have been able to assemble them.
And I have a question for anyone there, and it's sort of anecdotal. I don't know if you have this data, but are you noticing any significant issues with the individuals who are successful in obtaining a set aside in their job performance?
I can answer that question. The people who go through the set aside process and are successful tend to be the longest term employees, without a doubt. And I hypothesize that's due to two reasons. One, they've gone through the pain to, accomplish that and to reestablish their social capital, but also they're not going to make it past a lot of other background checks. They won't make it past a consumer level background check, even to do work in the bakery, because the fineness of the DHS background studies is different than that done by like a private entity that's just, you're either in or you're out.
Thank you. Do any other task force members have questions for New Way? Well, let me just be clear to thank you for your time today. This is really helpful, and obviously we need information from our community partners to understand what works well, what doesn't, and if changes are necessary, what those changes are. So thank you so very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Have a good day.
Hi, thank you guys for coming.
So we're going to move forward, and as the group knows, we did receive another data set from the Department of Human Services, and want to just have the data subcommittee talk for a couple minutes, and I'm going to defer to Madam Chair Williamson to kind of lead us on this just for a few minutes. Thank you so much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Chair and members of the task force and all who are present. Yes, so the data subcommittee, we have received the third data set from DHS, and this data set was in regards to crimes and conduct. And so the subcommittee, we are yet in review of not only the third data set, but all of them in conjunction. There is another data set that we are expecting in times coming. But we have put together a working document just to kind of go over ideals or interesting points that we're noticing as a subcommittee that we are yet formalizing in preparation for a presentation hopefully from DHS's data department, just to give mainly their interpretation of the data, as well as what have been some actionable items that have either come from it or that they're planning to do. Just for example, some of those ideals that the data subcommittee members have expressed is looking into the growth in disqualifications from 2018 to 2019, Minnesota disqualification percentages in comparison to other states. I know Remedies is kind of doing some of those comparisons already. Looking at the Minnesota recidivism and harm rates in comparison to other states. We're also looking in regards to financial information as far as the fiscal amounts in regards to disqualifications. And as we heard with the presentation that was given, the great presentation on today, this is quite expensive. And so being able to see what data we can get on that, particularly about how much on average background study costs the department in addition to reconsideration. And so we're also just looking, again, we are yet looking for data, not just from DHS, but from external standpoints as well, just so that we can make sure that we can get all the substantial evidence that we need in regards to the recommendations that this task force is looking to create in the coming months. I do want to defer to Member Kammer if there's anything in addition that he wants to add, because him and Vice Chair Evans have created some wonderful pie charts that have been presented, and we plan to present some more in the coming months as well. But I want to defer to either one of them as well as Mr. Vogel if they want to add anything at this time.
If we have time, I'd be happy to share a few of those pie charts, but certainly understand if we have a tight agenda that we can defer and wait until another time. Chair Geffen?
You know, my thought today was not to burden you guys with a presentation, because I think a more substantive one is coming.
Yep.
But really just to remind people, I felt like the data set came in and we were very focused on getting our preliminary report in. But to remind people how I think this data set is very important for the work that we do and are obligated to do. So to remind people, so I would say, Mr. Cameron, we might have a little bit of time, but it might make sense just to do it all in one fell swoop where we get all of it. And I would have to admit that sometimes I need to put on a hat when I look at numbers to focus on that numbers hat, because my brain doesn't process numbers very well. So maybe if it's okay with you, we'll defer on that.
Absolutely, absolutely. We'll look forward to it.
Okay. And you know, really that, like I might be repeating myself, but the goal here was to make sure that people have that data set. If for some reason it's buried in your email or somewhere, certainly shoot Mr. Vogel or me an email. I find it helpful to print this kind of stuff out and kind of put it in a binder and look at it. Maybe that's more of a tell of my age than anything, but I really think this is important data for us to understand, and we're going to have a lot of discussions about it. So I hope we get to all crack the book on it a little bit and move forward with that.
And I would make the invitation that if any member is looking at the data in the spreadsheets and so forth and says, I'd love to see this in color, let us know. And that's something we can do, certainly creating a pie chart or a stack chart or whatever makes sense, because sometimes the graphics are a little bit easier to digest than just a page of numbers. So we're happy to do that. And we're trying to think through as many questions as we can as we go through the data.
And even though individuals might not be in the data subcommittee, they certainly should feel free to send, Chair Williamson, and it sounds like Mr. Cameron, both of them, those types of suggestions. I would say anything that you can do to take numbers and make it more visual is helpful, certainly for me. And so I think it's a great idea. I think it's a good way to look at these. So I encourage other task force members to reach out to the data subcommittee with similar suggestions. And we really will be offline talking about when that presentation will be, but very much looking forward to it. Does anybody have any question for the leadership of the data subcommittee on just the data in general before we move on? Okay.
Thank
The other,
you, Chair.
please, yeah. And the other thing I want to say is thanks to the Department of Human Services for getting us information. And I think it's very well done and very thorough, and I appreciate it enormously. And obviously, DHS sometimes doesn't get the thumbs up when they do good. We only harass them, but we certainly want to recognize that. Thank you, Inspector Modi, for your leadership on that. And I think what we're going to move to now is a little bit of an open discussion, and the idea really to be, where do we go from here? Both in substance and how often are we going to meet? We sort of set our sights to get to where we are now and need to kind of recalibrate and see what's next. And so I think the first discussion we want to open up to is, what other presentations, what other issues should we be discussing in our larger groups? So I think a different discussion would be, if you're in a remedies or disqualification or data subgroup, if you want something specific to that, that might not be the discussion today, but what are some of the things you need more information about as you think about recommendations and so forth? Because we want to bring in people to get you the information you want. So just having kind of an open discussion about what do we need to do next to get to the next step, because we gave very vague, not vague, but general recommendations. At the end of this in December, we're going to need to be tightening that up a bit. So what do we need to do? Who do we need to bring in? Ms. Dawson, please.
Thank you. And I just thought it might be helpful. I know there has been talk in the various subcommittees of presenters that are already planning to come in. I'm wondering if that might be helpful for people to know who is scheduled. I believe Vice Chair Evans, you may know that, just so that we know who's already scheduled and if there are then additions to that.
So off the top of my head, should I raise my hand?
Please.
Formality. I'm
Please,
terrible.
Vice Chair Evans.
So the folks that I've already talked to are Violence Free Minnesota. I feel like we want to have that perspective come in. And then I spoke with an affiliate of Nicole's. Is Nicole on here? Doesn't look like it. So an affiliate of Nicole's agency. So not Nicole's agency, but an affiliate of Nicole's agency that I saw speak at the Human Services. They're called, gosh, I'm so terrible at this. Living Age, to come in and really talk about the workforce issue that they are struggling with. It's terrible. They had to shut down 8 homes in southwestern Minnesota that equated to 30 families. And those homes were shut down directly because of lack of workforce. They talked about it at the Human Services Committee, and they're like, it's crisis stuff that they're dealing with right now. And so I think having them come in to kind of talk about it from that other like provider type, I think would be great. And then do you have the list? Well, I sent a list out of.
Ms. Evans, I can pull that up. I also actually forwarded it to you and then pulled it down. So let me get it back up.
So there's like 3 or 4 folks that I've started initial conversations with, but I didn't want to like pull the trigger on anybody without Chair Geffen's like.
And I think one of the goals, Ms. Dawson, too, is for us to pretty much have a calendar that's several months ahead for the main group and the subcommittees to see who's coming in. And if you have interest in that presentation, you could always participate in it, even though you're not a member of that subcommittee, but trying to get us a little more forward thinking so we're several months out. I think it'll be moving and it'll be a living document that we'll add as we move forward. But I worry that the several members at the chair, the vice chair, and the subcommittees are making those decisions, and I just want to make sure that we're getting feedback from the group as a whole if there are issues you want to hear about.
So I found the rest of them. So Brandon Jones from the Minnesota Association of Children's Mental Health is going to come in and talk about children's brain development, not to do with criminal justice, just the brain development of children. And then Carrie Thorough from Leading Edge Minnesota, that's the other provider type that's nursing homes and in-home care and all of that stuff. And then victim impact, and I think having a couple of victims come in and talk is super important perspective that we need to have. And then the other thing would be like Jonathan Weinhagen or somebody from the St. Paul Chamber of Commerce to maybe come in and talk about some of that kind of stuff, or having yeah, so those are just some of my thoughts, and they're just initial conversations that I've had to see if people are interested, and without talking to the group, and I'm talking to you, like I haven't made any promises, just had some initial conversations. And Judge Soderbox got her hand up, just FYI.
Hi, Judge, and thank you. Please proceed.
Thank you. And I apologize, everybody. I have a cold. Hopefully my voice sounds okay. Just, and not to be devil's advocate here, because I think we've had a lot of really great presentations here. And I think we've focused quite a bit on the history of the statute, the weaknesses, the inefficiencies. I think that's been very evident. However, I think it's also important to have some presentations about maybe the legislative history, why the statutes came into effect in the first place. What are some of the strengths? Because we don't want to lose sight of those. We want to make sure that any changes we're making, that we're fixing the weaknesses and inefficiencies, but also bringing forward the whole reason why the statute and eligibility qualifications, all of that came into effect in the first place. So I think it would be important to bring some individuals in to speak on that as well.
I think that's a fantastic idea, and Judge, these are exactly some of the suggestions we're hoping for. So truthfully, I wouldn't have thought of that, and I think it's a great idea. And I wonder if, Inspector Modi, if you had any ideas on who might have that sort of institutional memory and understanding of the Background Studies Act, because it's existed for a while, but it's had changes, and who would be good for that, do you think?
We're not going to have very many people here left. That would have been probably under Jerry Kerber, the Inspector General. So I agree with some of that. I mean, we're going to have, it would take us some time to find, and if we have anything for us to reference back and on it, but we don't have any people left that were really here. So I don't know what is.
What's Jerry doing?
Mr. Kerber's, if my understanding, Mr. Kerber's enjoying his retirement.
Does this group have subpoena powers? Can we bring Jerry back? I always like Jerry. So
this might be where I would look to Mr. Vogel and the LCC about what other is with nonpartisan staff on that.
Of course.
That's kind of where I have. We don't have a whole lot.
Okay, thank you so much, Representative Robbins. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I was going to suggest, without having spoken to them, but our nonpartisan research staff is fantastic, and they generally have issue briefs or could provide something that would give the history. So I don't want to speak for them, but my guess is they would be happy to give a presentation to the committee.
I think that's a fantastic idea. Mr. Vogel, can you kind of, I'm sure you know those processes way better than we do, but that makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much, Representative. Ms. Dawson.
The other idea that I just had, and maybe it's separate, is there is the legislative reference library, and I know they've been super helpful when I've had to research the history of statutes. Of course, I've had to go there myself to do the research, but I don't know if they would have somebody. So that was just another idea.
And I think, you know, it seems like this is a great idea. Maybe Mr. Vogel, Vice Chair Evans, and whatever group this sort of fits under, we can meet offline and figure out the best way to find the right person and schedule that individual or individuals. I think it's a great idea. Thank you so much, Judge, again. We had talked in the past about maybe bringing in a defense attorney, whether it be a public defender and a prosecutor, to sort of go over some of the actual you know, disqualifying offenses and really what they mean. When do they get charged? When, you know, when is a case of 5th degree assault, which is a 7-year disqualification? When is it a disorderly conduct? I don't know if people have interest in that. I think we all have different levels of expertise, but you know, I know that, you know, not everybody here is a criminal defense attorney. So I see Ms. Kaser nodding her head, and I think that means that she thinks it's a good idea. But Mr. Kammer, okay, we're going to try to do that as well. I like the idea of bringing in both sides too, just to make sure we have, you know, that unbiased report.
And I can at least vouch. I mean, I know plenty, so
maybe we'll task Ms. Dawson with this.
I know plenty on both sides, so
okay, let's
help with that.
Okay, let's go. When we go offline, we'll sort of task Ms. Dawson. And I think the other thing I wanted to say is, as we move forward and calendar these things, I think our goal is to maybe even add a paragraph to each thing about what it is. You know, I know that today some, you know, 245G was thrown around and some acronyms. Let's see if we can get everybody on the same page even before, you know, we do that. Vice Chair Evans, please.
Yep. So the other thing that I have on my list is hearing from Nate Wrights. from the Minnesota Sentencing Guidelines Commission about
Yeah.
the actual 245C15 statute and to get their perspective on it. And then also maybe the Minnesota County Attorneys Association. Like, I feel like we really need a balanced perspective.
Do you think the County Attorney Association should be weighing in on 24515, or do you think in that discussion in general, with what Ms. Dawson's tasked with, are those separate?
I just feel like I always am. I want all the information and I want to hear from all parties. And so I mean, Representative Moeller's here, but I think as we get further down the road, like the people who we're gonna want to see our recommendations and all of that stuff are gonna want to know their thoughts. And so I think hearing their thoughts about the current state of things is going to be important to our recommendations. And so I think hearing from them is going to be important. Does anybody have thoughts about that?
I do. I think it's a really good idea. My only question is, do we ask for their input now, or do we come back later when we have some pieces together? And I don't know the answer to that, but and maybe both. I don't know. I mean, it seems the County Attorney Association is an important piece. Would seem to be certainly after we sort of address the legislative history and the purpose and goals. I think we know in a broad sense it's designed to protect, and I think we all agree with it, children and vulnerable individuals. We want to do that, but we want to do it in a way that doesn't damage other people too. So,
and Chair Geffen, if I
yes,
remember
Ms. Lawson.
correctly, I do think Mr. Page is on this task force on behalf of the Minnesota County Attorneys Association. So I think we may actually already have that. If I remember correctly, I just wanted to, if he's not here today, to say yes or no.
He had sent an email that he was going to be late. He had something, I don't know, is he on yet, Mr. Page? I don't. Well, why don't we again go offline with him a little bit and see if he's the person, or if he has somebody at the County Attorneys Association that would like to weigh into. Great ideas. This is wonderful. And I know that we're sort of like we always do. We just spring it on you in the morning, and if you're like me, an hour later, I'm going to have a great idea. But it isn't going to be right now. So certainly, if you do have those ideas, we want to hear from you. And it's never too late, because we want to continue to kind of build this. So let us know. Yeah, Judge.
I just thought of another thing too, since we're talking about county attorney associations, in conjunction with county attorneys, the agency that comes up to mind as far as having the most experience with some of the eligibility, disqualifications, and direct impact on individuals would be the social services agencies, because those individuals actually, quite honestly, usually know these statutes better than the county attorney's office. And when they're doing, investigations to, for example, like daycare facilities or foster parents, etc., they pay close attention to these qualifications or the disqualifications. They might, if you could find somebody that would be willing to come and speak maybe on their behalf, they might have some really good stories to give us and examples of maybe when the statutes were used effectively.
Certainly, and we are lucky enough to have Ms. Kaser and Ms. Sherlock, who work very closely in the sort of foster care side of it, and have been. And we were lucky enough to have Ms. Joanna Woolman present on some of the changes within the foster care program. But you're right, under the other areas, we don't have a lot. And certainly the social service agencies do a lot of the investigation of the maltreatment cases. And I would defer to Ms. Inspector Modi on this. It was always my understanding that some of the background stuff kind of came out of the county review and went to the state at one point. Inspector Modi, can you kind of?
Yes, actually, we're in the middle of when the pandemic decided to step in 2 years ago. We were in the final phases of that transition. So all of the background studies for childcare. So what we're calling the enhanced childcare background studies are being done by us now at the state that some of them for family childcare. So what people would typically think about as like an in-home daycare. Those used to be done at the county level. Those are now being done here at DHS because there are some very specific federal requirements related to the Child Care Development Block Grant that we have to do in order to continue to remain in compliance with that funding too. So those have been transitioned, or we're finishing the transition to DHS completing those background studies. But I just want to say, like, in the child care space, there are some very specific federal requirements that would, if changed, or the recommendations to change would jeopardize some of our standing in the work that we're doing there.
Thank you so much, Inspector Moody. But I think it's a good idea and Judge, certainly correct me if I'm wrong, to make sure that we're finding the people that are actually doing the work to give us the insight. I couldn't agree more with that. And Ms. Kaser, I just mentioned your name, and I see that your hand's up. Please, please.
Thank you, Chair Geffen. And I think just to piggyback off what you shared, yes, I think Ms. Sherlock and I can bring some of that perspective, having in our roles, and we are representing MAXA, which is the Minnesota Association of Social Services Administrators. So if we need broader perspective outside of maybe foster care or childcare licensing, which is an area I oversee as well, I'm happy to try to think about how to gather that and bring that forward as well.
And I think that's a good idea if you and Mr. Luck would be willing at some point to sort of present on what you see on the ground level. And then I guess I just wasn't thoughtful enough to think about MAXA, that you were involved in that. But we can talk offline of whether we want to bring another person in to kind of give that broader social services perspective. But I think that makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much, Ms. Kaser.
Mr. Chair, if you don't mind me interrupting, Mr. Page actually has just shown up in the waiting room, and I'm currently admitting him.
Okay. We'll ambush him right when he comes in, poor guy. Mr. Page, are you with us yet? Mr. Page, we're paging Mr. Page.
I guess my thought would be, would it behoove us, like, once we get through some of that other legislative and history stuff, to have them in one shot share their thoughts, and instead of piecemeal? So
When you say one shot, and they who just
like
hold
do
my
a
hand
presentation on like the Minnesota County Attorneys Association, like I don't know, just their thoughts on it, from their perspective or whatever.
Right. And so, Mr. Page, thank you for joining. I know you've had other things to deal with today, and I appreciate you giving us the time. While you were gone, we were picking on you and the County Attorneys Association and eagerly waiting for your arrival. And one of the things we're talking about, Mr. Page, is trying to set up and try to get ahead of it. Several more presentations that group members think would be instructive. And one of them that came up was having somebody present from the County Attorneys Association regarding essentially 245C and the disqualifications, whether or not there is an opinion. And we know that you are in part representing that organization. Is that something you would do, or something someone in the greater group would do? And is that something you and the larger organization would be willing to do?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Ms. Evans and I did speak about having someone from a victims' rights organization or the county attorneys speak to the issue of disqualifications. I can reach out to the internally to the County Attorneys Association and see if there is someone who would be willing to present, or if they have an individual that they work with that specializes in this area that could present on concerns regarding disqualifications, or what disqualifications mean to that group. And if not, if they have ideas on individuals who might provide a different perspective than some of the ones we have heard so far in the task force.
That's very helpful, Mr. Page. And I'm anticipating what we're going to do is have some very, I think the Vice Chair and I and Mr. Vogel might meet and just try to kind of figure out who do we want to bring in, and then defer to the other members to give us that help. So thank you so much, Mr. Page. Inspector Modi, please.
One suggestion I was going to give for in the childcare space, and an organization that you might want to consider reaching out to is the Minnesota Child Care Association. They do a lot of work, and I think a lot of their membership is childcare centers on that. And so that would be one group that I would suggest that you might want to consider reaching out to.
Do you know, I back in the day, it was one of the Dunkleys that was running the Child Care Association. Do you know who is the head?
I believe their legislative or government relations person is Claire Sanford.
Okay. Thank you. I think it's a great idea too. Thank you so much, Inspector Modi. Anybody else have any ideas on, and again, this is going to be an open dialogue for a while, but any other presentation ideas? If not, why don't we move on? And one of the things that we need to move on to is an understanding, and this is just for the large group, how often the large group is going to continue to meet. We had sort of said through the preliminary report, we would meet every 2 weeks, and we are now in need of just an agreement, I think, moving forward. We have 8 months. We're required to meet at least monthly. I continue to believe that where we are, we need to continue to do some hard work and some heavy lifting. So I think at this point, my recommendation is to continue to work or meet every other week. If there's any objection that people feel that that's too much, we want to open it up for discussion. But I think the recommendation moving forward is to keep the status quo with at least with the main group every 2 weeks. Certainly want to open it up now for discussion. Boy, I must be very convincing. I have convinced everybody to the righteousness of my cause. All right, so I think that's what we're going to keep doing. And certainly we understand that people have lives and careers and court appearances and court calendars and legislative issues. So we know not everybody's going to be present, but I've just been so heartened by everybody's continued dedication to this, and everybody's been showing up both in spirit and mind and everything, body. So thank you. Mr. Vogel, that's all I have on my agenda. Are there other things we need to, Mr. Irvin, please.
So I've mentioned this previously, but in our subcommittee, disqualifying crimes, we don't talk about it. Remedies may be, but it's the issue of someone being granted a set aside, but that set aside is only good for one particular license and not for the entire agency. And I've mentioned that in passing before. So this morning I pulled up one of our employees' employment record, and she started with us in 2017 in a non-client facing role. So we didn't do a DHS background at that time. In 2018, she applied internally for a client-facing role. We did a background study on her. She'd been working for us for a year, but she was disqualified and immediate removal was required with no supervision. So we could not put her in that role. She filed for reconsideration and was granted reconsideration shortly thereafter in September of 2018. And she went into that role and she worked successfully in that role for 3 years. She then applied for another job internally, which was in another program. And rather than just move her over there, we had to initiate another background study. Now, at this point, she's worked for us for 4 years, 3 years of which was under a set aside, and she's been a good employee. we have to initiate a new background study. We initiate the study and it comes back that she's disqualified. And she once again has to submit an application for reconsideration. And it just seems like that's unduly onerous when somebody has a pattern of behavior over a 4-year period of time in this case, but that the reconsideration was granted to us at Teen Challenge, but we couldn't move her from one program to another without starting all over again. And I just would hope that the remedies committee, subcommittee is looking at that.
Thank you so much, Mr. Irvin. And just so we can address it, Ms. Dawson, do you want to respond to that if you're able?
Yeah, no, and I do know we definitely were looking at that, as well as I think there's a lot we're definitely looking at, and that's one of the many pieces. I know Mr. Hansen, who's on this, had brought up some really good issues in one of our subcommittee meetings. And so I do know that issues like that are definitely something that we're looking at.
Chair Geffen, just for the record though, Kulani, can you talk about why that is? Just to get that on the record. I know you can't talk about the case specifically, but just like in general, why is that within an organization?
Within an organization. So
that needs to happen.
There are going to be, and this is where it can get very tricky and complicated, but there are going to be some federal requirements related to our FBI obligations about how we can and cannot share data. So although it's coming into us, we may not be able to share it across programs or whatnot because of the restrictions and the data privacy that are placed upon us coming from the feds. And that is, and we would have to take a look at that in order to ensure that we remain compliant and we're able to continue to receive that federal criminal history information. So it can get very tricky to do that, because even though it might be one large organization, they may be set up differently or under different provider types or have different licenses that have different requirements for which we need to be able to go through on that. I mean, we have some organizations that have 100 or 200 different license types, and each one of those are going to have different, and we aren't always able to share that information across board. Now, we do use it, we do look for efficiencies across the board to be able to see if we've looked at it, if things have changed, how do we do that? So it's not unused, but we can't always just pick up and share determinations, set asides, or variances. We can't just pick up and share it across the board without jeopardizing some of that compliance.
Yep. And is there a risk of harm in doing that? Or it's just that you guys would be out of compliance with federal requirements? That's what you're saying. It's a
yeah, that's what we would really have to look at. And if we're out of compliance, that not only puts in jeopardy the DHS's ability to receive that information, but potentially also the BCA, as they're the identified agency to receive that information. So that's why, you know, good conversation to have, but know that there will be those constraints on that.
I mean, and is there a possible workaround where the applicant for the background study waives that data practices ability as part of a subsequent background study?
There may be, but that's where we're going to have to really specifically look at that language.
Sure.
Because we had some of those in there, and if I remember correctly, and we had to remove it because the FBI didn't approve it. So it can get very technical, and I want to make sure that you're just aware of it. Good conversations to have. We need to be able to look into those, but it's going to be very specific on it. And once we know where we're going on that, we can reach out to our sister agency at the BCA and involve them in getting some more specifics. But yeah, that might not be sufficient.
Okay, thank you, Inspector. And it struck me today when one of the presenters talked about having 14 background studies for the same employer. It's been a common, I think, complaint. It makes sense, I think, in some situations, but not all. Thank you so much. Anybody else? Thank you, Mr. Irvin. Anybody else with any last comments, thoughts, suggestions? And Mr. Vogel, do we have anything else on the agenda that I'm missing?
Mr. Chair, I don't believe so.
Okay. I'm going to open it up one last time for last comments. Ms. Sailstrom.
Yeah, so I am part of the data subcommittee with Dr. Hammer, and one thing that I think is frustrating to me to look at is that time frame of disqualification. And if someone does have criminal charges and is on probation, my understanding is probation is a kind of a process of rehabilitation and getting someone to find those ways to be a productive member of society, but that time frame is not included in the time frame of disqualification. That time frame does not start until after a person is off probation. So I'm curious, when we're talking about like the statute and when those timeframes of disqualification were decided, like why is a probation period not included in that time frame of disqualification?
And as somebody on the disqualification subcommittee, we have looked at that issue. Judge Kulik had identified that during, I think really importantly, that during COVID, there are far fewer hearings. So people actually are going to have that period extended just because the courts weren't doing hearings. I think it's a great point, though, for us to ask when we get down to somebody identifying the legislative intent on that. And I would say, and I usually don't speak from the county attorney side, but for me, a lot of the time, the probationary period has been a little bit of like, for some people, like a training wheels period. Like, are you going to do okay, but you're still under supervision? And so then the end of probation is we take the training wheels off to see if you can do it without supervision. So that might be one of the arguments. That's at least something I've heard in the past. But again, I won't speak for the County Attorneys Association. Mr. Page is probably staring a hole through my head right now. But I agree, Ms. Hellstrom, we will certainly add that and want to keep that feedback, because it is something that we've been looking at, is what should the disqualification periods, waiting periods start? Yeah, Ms. Evans.
One more question, Ms. Modi, about, so we talked about the traveling set asides. Is that also a data practices issue, or is that provider types and moving between different provider types? Because we talked about do you remember that?
And Ms. Evans, could you identify, or Ms. Modi, what traveling set aside is for all the members, so we're all on the same page?
Ms. Evans, if you want to.
Yeah, I can do it, or you can do it. So a couple of years ago, as part of the March substance use disorder bill that we tried to pass, that in substance use disorder, if somebody had gotten a set aside and was moving from one substance use disorder program to another substance use disorder program, that set aside could travel with them a little more easily to help with workforce issues. And it passed, and we thought it was going to help, and come to find out it hasn't been super helpful. And so Ms. Modi and I were kind of trying to figure out why that was. And so I just was curious if this data practices thing was part of that.
Yeah, and some of it is data practices as to how it is data practices, but it's really FBI federal compliance, and it's the federal regs about what we can and cannot do with the data and what they will allow us to do with it. There is, I think, part of what people were hoping that change was going to allow is running into some of those constraints about what we can and cannot share and when things can move on there. I will say that I will have to get briefed on that a little bit more. It's been a while since I've looked at that legislation and what we specifically did, but that was, as we were providing the TA on that, that was one of the things that we were specifically looking at, is making sure that we were not running afoul of any of our federal requirements.
Anybody else? All right, last call. So with that, I think we'll be adjourned for today. Obviously, if you guys have issues, questions, let's keep communicating. And thanks to everybody. Anything else, Mr. Vogel, before we sign off?
Mr. Chair, I don't believe so.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Have a good